I only meant to walk into the bank and say no. That was all I had planned that Tuesday morning in Portland. One short word. 2 letters. A word I had practiced in my head while brushing my hair while walking past the cracked sidewalks of any Broadway, while pushing open the heavy glass doors of Harbor and Hearth Community Bank at the corner of any Broadway and 15th Avenue. No. Simple final protective. But the moment I said it, my entire world collapsed in a storm of rage, shame, and betrayal that would echo across every street I had ever called home. I had told myself the fluorescent lights in that bank lobby always made people look sickly, and maybe they did, but under those lights my stepfather Randall Pierce turned into something monstrous. He had been pacing near the teller line, his work boots leaving faint marks on the marble, and when I whispered my refusal when I told him I would not co-sign the $200,000 loan, he demanded, his face shifted to a violent shade of purple I knew too well from childhood. In an instant, the smell of printer ink and the steady whir of the money-counting machines fused into the sound of my skull colliding with the cold floor. He slammed my head down so hard that stars burst across my vision, the marble unforgiving against my temple, and the gasp of the other customers stabbed into my ears like sirens. I was not a child anymore, but at that moment I felt 12 again, small-cornered, voiceless. Above me, his breath smelled of stale beer and fury as he shouted about family obligations, about gratitude, about roofs and meals I supposedly owed him for. And then, through the fog of pain and humiliation, I heard the softest voice, the one I had once trusted, the one I had clung to when my father died on a worksite years before. My mother Linda bent close, her church dress swishing against my arm as she whispered not a plea for my safety, not a demand for him to stop, but words that froze my heart in a deeper way than the marble beneath me. Do not shame us, Emily. Stay quiet. Stay quiet. My blood smeared on the edge of the rope barrier, my dignity scattered across the lobby, and she told me to be silent. In that split-second silence felt worse than the slam itself. I staggered when the guards pulled him away, my blouse torn at the shoulder, the taste of copper in my mouth, and all I could think was that every door around me opened for strangers, but the one door I needed most, the door to my family, was forever locked. I remember gripping the counter just to keep from falling again, the way the fluorescent light hummed above like judgment, the way whispers circled around me from customers who pretended to focus on their deposit slips but could not stop staring. And I remember lifting my chin, tasting blood, and promising myself that this time I would not back down. This time the word no would mean everything. This is my story, and it begins on the cold marble floor of a Portland bank where loyalty ended and justice began. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments because I want to know. My name is Emily Warren, and I was 19 years old the morning my head hit the marble at Harbor and Hearth Community Bank on NE Broadway and 15th Avenue. I had graduated just the year before from Grant High School in Northeast Portland, the kind of school where you walked past rows of maple trees every morning and heard the MAX train clattering down the tracks a few blocks away. I was not the smartest in my class, not the most popular, but I had carried myself with quiet determination working weekends as a cashier at the Fred Meyer in the Lloyd District just to save enough for books and tuition at Portland Community College's Cascade campus. My dream was small, but it mattered to me. I wanted independence to study business administration to one day manage something of my own instead of being controlled by men who treated me like an extension of their debts. My father had been a journeyman electrician, one of the men who worked out on Swan Island, wiring up warehouses and shipyards, a man who believed in earning every dollar with sweat. I was only 9 when the accident took him a collapsed scaffold and a fall that should have been prevented if safety rules had been followed. I remember the sirens that day, the way neighbors brought casseroles, the way my mother Linda clung to his jacket for weeks as if the smell of copper wire and sweat could substitute for his presence. For a while, she tried. She took an office assistant job at a dentist's clinic on Alberta Street, but grief wore her down, and by the time I was 11, she had married Randall Pierce. He had been a contractor, a man who bragged about building half of East Portland with his bare hands, but by the time he came into our lives, he was already stumbling from job to job. At first, I wanted to believe he was just rough around the edges. He would bring home buckets of nails, scraps of lumber talk about projects at East Bank contractors, and pretend that money was about to roll in. But the reality was unpaid invoices, drinking binges, and rage that flared every time someone said no to him. My mother said he was providing that I had to respect him. Respect was the word she repeated over and over, as if repeating it could hide the fact that bills piled up and Randall's fists sometimes slammed the kitchen table so hard the salt shaker toppled. By 14, I had learned to hide my allowance money in library books. I still remember the day he snatched my phone and hurled it against the wall because I refused to give him my babysitting cash. At 16, he tried to make me co-sign for a used Corolla at Toyota of Portland on SE 82nd Avenue. I said no, shaking in the dealership, while salesmen looked away, and when we got home, I was grounded for 2 months, accused of being ungrateful. Every time I protested, my mother's voice cut sharper than his boots ever could. Do not shame him, Emily. He is providing for us. So I swallowed my anger, worked longer shifts at Fred Meyer, saved for a future no one in that house believed I deserved. Daniel was the only one who believed me. My half-brother, older by 6 years, had the same father as me, but had already left by the time Randall moved in. He joined the Navy, stationed up in Bremerton, across the water in Washington. When he came home on leave, he carried himself straighter, calmer, like someone who had seen enough storms to know which ones mattered. He used to tell me to get out as soon as I turned 18, to stop letting them break me down, but blood and guilt tied me tighter than I wanted to admit. I kept telling myself that Linda was still my mother, that maybe she would find her spine again. But she never did. And so, by 19, I was balancing shifts at Fred Meyer classes at PCC Cascade and the constant pressure of Randall's schemes. He talked about property deals on 82nd and Division, about strip malls that were about to explode in value, about needing just one cosign to unlock $200,000 that would supposedly set us all free. But I had watched him default on smaller loans, had seen collection letters come in waves, had felt the sting of his disappointment when I refused to sign. I knew if I gave him this, my credit and my future would vanish just like my father had vanished from that scaffold. That was why I went to the bank that morning. I wanted to tell him no in a place where there were cameras and witnesses because deep down I knew he would not accept it quietly. The plan was simple. Say no walkout, go to my shift at Fred Meyer, and keep building my own life. But the plan collided with marble and fluorescent light and the sound of my mother telling me not to shame them. That is who I was when all this began. Emily Warren, 19 years old, cashier in Portland, daughter of a dead electrician, stepdaughter of a man who saw me as collateral sister of a sailor who knew too well what Randall was capable of. A girl with a Target blouse, a college ID in her pocket, and a future hanging by the thread of one small word. No. I used to think my teenage years would be about music friends, late-night study sessions, and dreams of college. Instead, my teenage years became a crash course in survival under Randall's roof. He came into our lives like a thunderstorm that never passed heavy boots, louder voice, and a presence that swallowed all the oxygen in the room. I was 14 the first time I realized that resistance meant destruction. I had earned $50 babysitting for a neighbor on any Prescott Street money I planned to use for school supplies and maybe a new pair of sneakers. Randall found the bills folded inside my math book. He called me selfish for hiding it, claimed that family money belonged to the family, and when I said quietly that it was mine, he ripped the book out of my hands and hurled my phone against the wall. The screen cracked like ice on the Willamette River in winter, tiny shards scattering across the kitchen linoleum. My mother stood at the counter, arms folded, lips pressed thin. She did not yell at him. She did not defend me. She whispered the same phrase that would haunt my adolescence. Do not shame us, Emily. You should be grateful. I wanted to scream that gratitude had nothing to do with letting a man steal from a child, but the words died in my throat. That was the first lesson Randall taught me. Money was power. Silence was survival. By the time I was 16, his demands grew bigger. He drove me to Toyota of Portland on SE 82nd Avenue, a place where balloons floated above shiny hoods and salesmen circled like vultures. He wanted a used Corolla, and he wanted me to co-sign. I still remember sitting in the cramped office, the salesman sliding papers across the desk, Randall glaring at me like a wolf, daring me to refuse. My hands shook, but I whispered, "No." Randall's jaw tightened. The salesman shifted uncomfortably, probably wishing he was anywhere else. Randall did not explode in the dealership, not with cameras overhead, but the punishment came later. He grounded me for 2 months. He locked away my laptop. He told relatives I was difficult, that I thought I was better than the family that fed me. My mother echoed his words, twisting the knife with soft tones that sounded like love, but felt like betrayal. "He is providing, Emily. He is trying. Do not shame him." I learned to measure my steps carefully to anticipate the thunder before it struck. There were nights when I heard him downstairs arguing about bills, about contractors refusing to work with him, about jobs gone wrong. He drank more, shouted more, and every time I pushed back, he found new ways to break me down. At 17, I wanted to apply for an early admission program at Portland State University. I had the grades, I had the counselor's recommendation, but the application fee was $60. When I asked my mother if she could help cover it, Randall overheard. He slammed his fist on the table and said no money of his would go toward something useless. I swallowed the disappointment, went to work an extra shift at Fred Meyer, and paid it myself, but the acceptance letter never came because he intercepted the mail. I only found out months later when a neighbor mentioned seeing a PSU envelope in our box. He had thrown it out before I could read it. That was the kind of control he exercised, not just over money, but over hope itself. And through it all, my mother stayed loyal to him, nodding along, telling me that sacrifices were necessary, that I should not embarrass the family by talking about our struggles. It was easier to pretend nothing was wrong, she said. Easier for whom I wanted to shout, easier for her, never for me. By the time I turned 18, the house on Alberta Street no longer felt like a home. It felt like a holding cell where every choice I made had to be filtered through Randall's moods. I learned to listen for the way his truck rattled when it pulled into the driveway, to gauge his temper by how heavily his boots landed on the porch, to sense if tonight would be loud or quiet, dangerous or tolerable. My escape became the small freedoms I carved out for myself. Shifts at Fred Meyer in the Lloyd district were exhausting, especially on weekends when the lines stretched past the lottery machines, but those hours were mine. At the register, I was not Randall's stepdaughter. I was just Emily, the cashier, who bagged groceries quickly, who remembered customers by name, who smiled at kids clutching candy bars. It was a fragile identity, but it gave me strength. Still, Randall's schemes never stopped circling me. That fall, he cornered me at the kitchen table with blueprints spread out like treasure maps. He talked about a redevelopment deal near 82nd and Division, about storefronts and rental income, about needing a $200,000 loan. He looked at me like I was the key in his pocket. "Just your signature," he said. "Just a name on a line." But I remembered the Corolla. I remembered the babysitting money. I remembered the way my mother's silence cut deeper than his shouts. I told him no. He slammed his hand down so hard, the salt shaker toppled again, just like years before. Linda rushed in, not to stop him, but to scold me. "Do not shame him, Emily. He is building a future for us." For us, or for himself, I wanted to ask, but I had learned the futility of questions in that house. The night he found me filling out FAFSA forms on my laptop, he sneered and said no college would want someone who could not even be loyal to family. He said I was wasting my time. I shut the screen, tears blurring the keyboard, but deep inside, something hardened. I would not give him my signature, my credit, my future. That resolve grew each time he pressed, each time Linda whispered those poisonous words. I began to understand that silence was their weapon. Silence allowed him to keep taking. Silence made me complicit. And so when the day came that Randall told me to meet him at Harbor and Hearth Community Bank on NE Broadway, I knew it was a trap. He said the manager would be there, that all I had to do was sign that it was already prepared. My stomach churned as I walked past the bakery on 15th Avenue, the smell of cinnamon rolls wafting from the doorway, ordinary life continuing while my own life twisted tighter. I promised myself that morning would be different. I would say no clearly, loudly if I had to in a place with cameras and witnesses. I thought that would be enough. I thought the presence of strangers would protect me, but I underestimated the force of his desperation. The flashbacks of every slammed table, every broken phone, every torn envelope burned through my mind as I pushed those glass doors open. I can still feel the way the cool metal handle pressed against my palm, the way my heart thudded louder than the money-counting machines inside. I believed then that refusing him would set me free. Instead, refusing him shattered the illusion of safety and set in motion a chain of events that would strip away every lie, every secret, until the whole city knew what he had done. The morning air outside Harbor and Hearth Community Bank felt ordinary, almost deceptively calm. The sun filtered weakly through the gray Portland sky, glinting off car hoods parked along any Broadway. I stood for a moment at the corner of Broadway and 15th Avenue, staring up at the modest brick facade of the bank. People bustled around me, a man locking his bike to a rack, a woman hurrying across the street with a latte, all living their unremarkable lives, while I braced for what I knew would become the most remarkable day of mine. My palms sweated as I pulled open the glass door and stepped into the fluorescent light. The familiar smell of printer ink and the low mechanical whir of the money-counting machines enveloped me, sounds and scents that usually meant stability for most people, but now made my stomach clench. Randall was already there. He stood near the velvet rope divider, his boots planted wide on the marble, a stack of papers clutched in his hand. His face lit with false cheer as he spotted me, but his eyes betrayed him, bloodshot, hungry, desperate. Just a signature, he said, voice pitched low but tight. Sign this and we're set. I felt the weight of every year under his roof pressing down on me, every slammed table, every broken dream. I thought of my credit score, my small savings from Fred Meyer, my dream of one day walking into a classroom at Portland State without his shadow behind me. No, I said. My voice trembled, but the word held. I'm not signing anything. For a heartbeat, the lobby froze. The tellers behind the counters glanced up. A man in line shifted uncomfortably. The light above hummed louder, as if amplifying the silence between us. Then, Randall's face darkened, flushing into the purple rage I had come to dread. He stepped forward. Ungrateful, he hissed the words spitting from his mouth. After all I've done for you. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a force that made my shoulder ache, and before I could pull free, he shoved me backward. My body slammed against the rope post, the cold metal jarring into my ribs. I gasped, the air knocked out of me, and stumbled to my knees. Pain shot up my legs from the marble, but worse was the sudden crack when he pressed harder, forcing my head down against the floor. The world blurred, stars exploding across my vision. Gasps erupted from the customers, a chair scraped loudly. Someone shouted for security. My cheek pressed against the cold stone. I tasted blood where my lip split, and through the haze I heard the words that cut deeper than any blow. My mother's voice calm and steady as she leaned down just enough for me to hear. Don't shame us, Emily. Stay quiet. Stay quiet. As if I had orchestrated this scene, as if my resistance was the problem, not the man grinding my head into the marble. The betrayal seared me more than the impact itself. I lifted my eyes through blurred tears and saw the blur of navy jackets as 2 security guards rushed in. They seized Randall by the arms, pulling him back, even as he shouted about family, about obligations, about roofs over heads and meals on tables. My mother did not rush to me. She straightened her dress, folded her hands, and stepped aside as though nothing unusual had happened. My blouse was torn, a smear of blood spreading near the collar. My hair tangled, but I forced myself upright. The entire lobby stared, and that was when I saw him. Mr. Dalton, the branch manager, emerging from his glass-walled office. His eyes flickered to the papers Randall had dropped, then back to me, then down again. Something in his expression shifted, a tight swallow, a sudden paleness. He picked up the loan application, scanned the signature line, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he quietly closed the folder, slid it into the desk drawer at the officer's station, and locked it with a trembling hand. "Miss Warren," he said softly, "when did you sign these papers?" My head pounded as I stared at Mr. Dalton, the edges of the lobby spinning his question, slicing through the fog. "When did you sign these papers?" he asked again, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. I managed to say, my voice hoarse, trembling. "I never signed anything. That's why I came here today to tell him no. I won't co-sign." Dalton's hands shook as he set the application down, eyes darting once toward the security camera in the corner. He pressed the key harder into the lock of the drawer, turning it until the click echoed louder than any sound in the lobby. I realized in that instant he was afraid. Not just of Randall, who was still struggling against the guards, but of something deeper written on those papers. The other customers pretended to return to their business, but I could feel their eyes crawling over me over my torn blouse and bloodied lip. The humiliation stung, but underneath it anger sparked small but fierce. I turned to Dalton and steadied my breath. "I'm pressing charges," I said, each word deliberate. My mother's heels clicked against the floor as she stepped closer. I thought just for a moment she might finally defend me, might put her body between mine and Randall's, but instead she leaned close, her perfume heavy with roses, and whispered so only I could hear. "Please, Emily, don't shame us. Don't make this worse." Her words pushed me deeper into resolve. I lifted my chin and faced Dalton. "Did you hear me? I'm pressing charges." Dalton nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on that locked drawer. "I think we need to handle this very carefully," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then came the sound of sirens outside, faint at first, then louder until the glass doors swung open and uniformed officers from the Portland Police Bureau North Precinct rushed in. The security guards released Randall into their custody. He was still shouting veins bulging spewing words about ungrateful daughters, about family betrayal, about obligations owed. One officer cuffed him reading his rights in a steady voice while another spoke into a radio clipped at his shoulder. My mother followed as they led Randall out, her face a mask of quiet composure, as if attending a church service rather than witnessing her husband being hauled into the back of a squad car. She never once looked at me. My knees shook, but I forced myself to remain standing. Dalton approached again, a small white first aid kit in his hands. He offered it with an expression that carried both guilt and urgency. "Please, Miss Warren, come to my office. There's something we need to discuss." I followed him into the glass cubicle, the blinds rattling slightly as he closed the door behind us. The room smelled of coffee and leather, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of blood still clinging to my mouth. He sat heavily in his chair, opened the locked drawer again, and slid the papers onto the desk. He ran a hand through his thinning hair before speaking. "The signature on these documents," he said slowly, "was dated last Thursday. You're certain you never signed them?" "Never," I answered firmly. "I've refused to co-sign anything for years. Randall knows that." Dalton's eyes flicked down to the signature again, then up to me. He exhaled sharply. "Then someone forged your name, and I have reason to believe I know how." His words sent a chill through me that no marble floor could match. What had been a violent family confrontation was now something larger, something written in ink and hidden in drawers. Outside, the bank lobby returned to its usual murmur, but in that office the air was heavy charged, as if every choice from here on would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. The officers guided me gently out of Mr. Dalton's office and into the lobby where the fluorescent lights felt harsher than ever. My knees trembled as though the marble floor might open beneath me, but the guards kept me steady. Outside, the late-morning traffic on NE Broadway buzzed as if nothing unusual had happened, but for me, every sound was amplified. The sirens fading, the murmur of customers still lingering inside the squeak of my shoes on polished stone. The officers asked if I needed medical attention. I touched the side of my head, where Randall had slammed it down, and winced at the swelling, the sticky trace of blood at my lip. "Yes," I whispered, though admitting it made me feel weak. They radioed for an ambulance, but I shook my head. "No hospital ride. Please, I can walk." Mr. Dalton insisted, his voice more urgent now than it had been when Randall was shouting. "She needs proper evaluation," he told the officers. "We'll take her to Legacy Emanuel. It's closest." That was how I ended up sitting in the back of a patrol car, the city blurring past the window as we headed north on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. I pressed a tissue to my lips, staring at the shops and small restaurants flashing by places where ordinary people bought sandwiches, groceries, or hardware, while I felt like a ghost floating through my own hometown. At Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center on North Gantenbein Avenue, the ER staff whisked me into a curtained bay. The antiseptic smell burned my nose, and the fluorescent lights above the bed glared just like the banks. A nurse in light blue scrubs took one look at the swelling on my head and the tear in my blouse and said quietly, "Sweetheart, we're going to take good care of you." She cleaned the blood from my lip, asked me to follow her finger with my eyes, and scribbled notes on a chart. A doctor arrived, her eyes lined with fatigue, but her voice kind. "Mild concussion," she explained. "You'll need rest and we'll document everything for the police." She handed the officer copies of the report and made sure I understood how important it was to have these records. I clutched the paperwork with shaking hands, realizing these papers were more powerful than Randall's schemes. For once, the ink told the truth. As I sat there, the curtain shifted and a familiar voice cut through the sterile hum of the ER. "M." My brother Daniel stood in the doorway, his navy jacket still zipped, eyes blazing with something between fury and grief. He had driven all the way from Beaverton the moment I called. When he saw my torn blouse and bruised face, his jaw tightened so hard I thought he might shatter his teeth. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into a hug that smelled of sawdust and motor oil, the scent of the garage where he spent weekends fixing old furniture. For the first time all day, I let myself lean into someone. "He did this," Daniel said, his voice low but trembling with rage. "Randall did this." I nodded, unable to speak. He held me tighter. "This ends now. You're not going back there." His certainty steadied me in a way nothing else could. The nurse looked at him with understanding, then left us a moment of privacy. I showed him the paperwork, the medical report, the bruise blossoming across my shoulder. He scanned it all like evidence in a case, nodding grimly. "We'll document everything he said. Every bruise, every cut, every word. We'll build a wall of truth they can't knock down." His words lit something inside me, hope mixed with resolve. For years, I had been the only one resisting the lone voice against Randall and Linda's chorus of silence. Now I had an ally who would not waver. After the doctor cleared me to leave, Daniel took charge as if he had been preparing for this his whole life. He signed the discharge papers, tucked the medical report carefully into a folder he had brought from the garage, and guided me out of Legacy Emmanuel into the gray Portland afternoon. The air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust from traffic on Vancouver Avenue, but breathing it felt like reclaiming something stolen. A patrol car waited by the curb. Officer Hernandez, the one who had responded at the bank, nodded at me. "Miss Warren, we'll need a formal statement back at the North Precinct," he said. I swallowed hard, but Daniel answered for me. "She'll do it. We'll be there." In the car, Daniel kept one arm across the back of the seat protective, in a way that reminded me how our father used to drive us around Swan Island before the accident. The memory ached, but it also steeled me. At the precinct on North Emerson, they led us into a small interview room with walls painted the color of old oatmeal. The officer set a recorder on the table and asked me to recount everything: the confrontation, the slam on the marble, my mother's whisper, Mr. Dalton's reaction. My voice shook, but I forced myself to speak each detail clearly. Daniel sat beside me, his hand on the table near mine, silently promising that I wasn't alone. When I described the forged signature Dalton had locked away, the officer leaned forward. "That makes this more than assault. That's financial fraud." He typed rapidly into his report. "We'll add that to the file." By the time we left the precinct, dusk was settling over the North Portland streets, neon signs flickering to life above corner markets. My phone buzzed with blocked numbers, but I silenced it. I knew it was Linda, and I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. Daniel drove us west toward his place in Beaverton, the highway lights stretching like a tunnel of safety. "You're staying with me," he said firmly. No arguments. I didn't argue. The thought of returning to that house on Alberta Street made my stomach twist. In his apartment above a hardware store, the smell of varnish and fresh lumber filled the air. Tools lined the counter, an unfinished oak table sprawled across the living room, sandpaper sheets stacked neatly on top. Daniel set the folder with my medical report on the table as if it belonged there among his tools. "We're building a case," he said, "piece by piece." That night, he pulled out his camera, photographed every bruise, every scratch, even the faint mark on my shoulder where the rope post had caught me. "This is evidence," he said, his voice calm but burning. "They can deny your words, but not your body." I felt exposed, ashamed, but also grateful. For once, someone wanted to preserve the truth instead of bury it. Later, over takeout, Chinese spread across mismatched plates, Daniel laid out the next step. "We need a lawyer," he said. "Not just any lawyer. Someone who knows how to handle both domestic violence and financial fraud." I hesitated. "I can't afford that." He cut me off. "We can. I've been saving. And I'd rather spend every cent helping you than watch Randall destroy you piece by piece." He pulled out his laptop, fingers flying across the keys as he searched. Names, firms, reviews scrolled by until he paused. "Miranda Rios," he read aloud. "Seattle-based. Specializes in exactly this. Tough, thorough, aggressive. Clients say she never lets anyone slip through cracks." He looked at me. "This is who we need." The next morning, as the rain misted over the Willamette River and gray clouds pressed low over the city, I made the call. Her assistant answered briskly, and when I explained about the assault, the forged signature, the police report, her tone shifted. "We can fit you in today," she said. 10:30. Don't be late." Hanging up my hands shook not from fear this time, but from a strange new energy. For the first time, it felt like the fight wasn't mine alone. With Daniel at my side and a lawyer ready to listen, I was no longer just the girl slammed on a bank floor. I was someone who could fight back. The drive north to Seattle the next morning felt heavier than any road trip I had ever taken, even though the highway stretched wide and the Columbia River glimmered faintly in the distance. Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel, but I could see the tension in his jaw every time my phone buzzed with another blocked call. I had silenced it hours ago, yet the vibrations still made my skin crawl. Linda had not stopped trying. She left voicemails pleading for me to think about the family, as though family meant obeying a man who forged my name and slammed my head into marble. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window, whispering to myself that I was not going back. Not this time. By the time we reached downtown Seattle, the sky was a flat sheet of gray, and the tall frame of Smith Tower pierced through the mist. Daniel parked near Pioneer Square, and together we walked into the historic lobby with its marble columns and brass accents. For a moment, I thought about how different this marble was from the banks. The polished elegance here felt like a place where truth might stand a chance. Upstairs, Miranda Rios's office was lined with case files stacked in neat piles, law books arranged in tight rows, and framed photographs of past clients shaking her hand. She was in her early 40s, with sharp brown eyes and hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She rose as we entered, extending a hand that was firm but warm. "Emily," she said, "I've reviewed the basics your brother emailed. I want to hear it from you directly. Start at the beginning." My throat tightened, but Daniel gave me a nod and I began. I told her about the bank, about Randall's rage, about the papers Dalton had locked away. I told her about Linda's whispers, the way silence had been forced on me for years. Miranda listened without interrupting, her pen moving quickly across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back, tapping the pen against her chin. "You've got two fronts here," she said, "criminal and financial. The assault charge is already in motion thanks to the police report and your medical records. That's straightforward, but the forged signature," she tapped the pad for emphasis, "that's bigger. That's fraud, forgery, possibly identity theft. And if the loan officer cooperated knowingly, we're talking conspiracy." My stomach twisted. I had braced for Randall's violence, but hearing my life described in legal terms made it suddenly immense, like a storm too big to outrun. "What do we do?" I asked. Miranda leaned forward, her voice steady. "We gather every shred of evidence. Medical reports, photographs of injuries, financial documents, credit reports. If he's been forging your name once, he's likely done it before. We'll subpoena the bank records, and I'll need you to order a full credit history from all three bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. Fraud leaves footprints, Emily. We just have to follow them." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll do it," he said firmly. Miranda nodded. "Good. And one more thing, do not communicate with your mother or stepfather directly. Every voicemail, every text, save it. Silence is their shield. Documentation will be yours. That night back in Portland, Daniel set up his laptop on the oak table in his apartment. We logged onto the credit bureau sites one by one. Each report loaded slowly, the digital wheel spinning like it knew I was about to learn truths I wasn't ready for. My stomach clenched tighter with each line. Accounts I had never opened, balances I had never touched, a Wells Fargo credit card with a $3,000 limit maxed out on charges at hardware stores across town. A personal loan at the Wells Fargo Broadway branch I had never even visited. And worst, a Bank of America account linked to the Pioneer Courthouse Square branch with late fees stacking up month after month. My credit score had plummeted from a healthy 720 to a wrecked 480 in less than 2 years. Daniel let out a sharp breath. He's been stealing your future one form at a time. I stared at the numbers, the debt, the false addresses that matched Linda's handwriting and felt both fury and relief. Fury that this had been happening right under my nose. Relief that it was no longer invisible. Fraud leaves footprints. Miranda was right. And now we had the trail. The next morning, Daniel and I drove back up to Seattle, the folder of freshly printed credit reports riding in my lap like a stack of dynamite. Every page felt explosive, each line of fraudulent debt a fuse Randall had lit under my life. When we arrived at Miranda's office, she ushered us in immediately, her sharp eyes scanning the papers as though she had been waiting for them all night. Wells Fargo Broadway Branch Bank of America, Pioneer Courthouse Square, she muttered, flipping page after page. Classic pattern local banks, repeated addresses, forged co-signatures. And look at this billing address. She tapped the page hard. N.E. Alberta Street. That's your mother's handwriting if I'm not mistaken. My throat closed. Daniel leaned forward. She's complicit. Miranda didn't flinch. If these addresses match her documentation, then yes. The paper trail ties her directly. I wanted to argue to believe Linda had been ignorant, but the evidence sat there in black ink, undeniable. Miranda straightened in her chair. We'll subpoena both branches for original applications. If the signatures are forged, handwriting analysis will prove it. And if the loan officer knowingly pushed these through, he's in just as deep as Randall. Daniel's jaw clenched. Bradley Hutchkins, he said, recalling the name from a business card Randall had once bragged about. Miranda jotted it down without hesitation. He'll be on the list. Banks cooperate quickly when federal charges loom. I'll have subpoenas filed by Friday. The certainty in her voice steadied me, but fear still curled in my stomach. What if they retaliate? I asked. Randall isn't above intimidation. Miranda's gaze softened for the first time. He'll try. They always do. But with protective orders in place and the police report already active, every step he takes only digs his hole deeper. Your job is to keep breathing, keep documenting, and keep trusting the process. Daniel nodded firmly beside me. We'll handle it. On the drive back down, I replayed every word, clinging to Miranda's calm authority. Still, the weight of betrayal pressed heavy. Linda's address on fraudulent accounts, her silence in the bank, her whispered plea not to shame them, it all added up to a truth I had avoided for years. She wasn't just weak. She was willing. That night in Beaverton, Daniel cleared the oak table again, laying out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle. Medical report photos of my bruises, credit histories, police statement. Each piece connected to the next until the story was no longer mine alone, but a case with shape, weight, and consequence. This is how we fight him, Daniel said. Not with fists, not with fear, with proof. His words echoed in me louder than Randall's shouts had ever been. For the first time since that marble floor, I felt a thread of control weaving back into my hands. We emailed everything to Miranda, scanned and double-checked, then stored the originals in a locked metal box Daniel kept in his closet. He handed me the key. You keep this, he said. It's your life on paper. No one else touches it. I held the small key tightly, realizing it symbolized more than protection. It was ownership of my own story. Before bed, I checked my phone. Another voicemail blinked. I pressed play, bracing myself. Linda's voice filled the room, shaky but still pleading. Emily, you'll destroy us all if you keep this up. Please, just think about what people will say. Think about family. I deleted it without replying. For years, I had been told silence was loyalty, that keeping secrets was love. Now I understood silence was only control, and I was done being silent. The first sign that Randall wasn't finished came 3 nights later. Daniel and I returned from Fred Meyer just after closing, carrying takeout cartons and tired laughter up the narrow staircase to his apartment in Beaverton. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish from the woodworking shop below, but when Daniel slid the key into the lock, it caught awkwardly. He frowned, tried again, then shoved harder. The door swung open with a splintering creak, and my stomach dropped. Inside, the apartment was chaos. The quilt our grandmother had given me hand-stitched squares of faded blues and reds lay half-burned in the sink, a corner of fabric blackened and curling as if someone had tried to set it alight before losing nerve. My textbooks were strewn across the floor, pages ripped, spines broken. The oak table Daniel had been building for weeks was scarred with deep gouges as though someone had dragged a knife across its surface in deliberate patterns. I clutched the doorframe to steady myself, my pulse hammering. Randall's voice echoed in my memory, growling about family first. A folded piece of paper sat neatly on the counter, too neat against the wreckage. Daniel snatched it up, his face tightening as he read aloud. "Family first. Drop the charges, or this gets worse." My knees weakened. The words were short, almost childish, but the threat in them pulsed louder than any scream. Daniel crushed the note in his fist. "He was here," he said, his voice low and sharp. "He wants to scare you back into silence." The police came quickly after Daniel called their flashlights, slicing across the wreckage, their radios crackling with codes. Officer Hernandez, the same one from the bank, surveyed the quilt in the sink and shook his head. "Classic intimidation tactic. We'll file this as evidence for your protective order." He snapped photographs, bagged the note, and promised extra patrols near the building. Still, when the officers left the apartment, felt colder, as if Randall's shadow lingered in every corner. That night, I lay awake on the couch staring at the ceiling, listening for every creak and rustle. My phone buzzed again near midnight. A blocked number. I shouldn't have answered, but exhaustion weakened my resolve. Linda's voice filled my ear, hushed and desperate. "Emily, please, you'll destroy us all." Randall just lost his temper. "Don't let this go to court. People will talk. The family name will be ruined." My throat tightened, anger sparking hot. "He tried to burn my things," I whispered back. "He forged my name, slammed my head on a bank floor, ruined my credit." "You call that losing his temper?" Silence hung heavy on the line. Then she whispered, "He's still your stepfather. Please, Emily, stay quiet." I hung up my hands, shaking, tears burning hot down my face. For years, I had begged her to see me, to defend me, to choose me. And here she was, choosing him again. Daniel heard the click of the phone and sat up in the armchair across the room. "Her?" he asked. I nodded, unable to form words. He rubbed his face with both hands, then said, "She's in as deep as he is. You have to accept that." Accepting it felt like cutting off a limb, but deep down, I knew he was right. The mother I wanted was gone. All that remained was a woman bound to Randall's destruction, and she was willing to drag me down with him. The following week, the intimidation turned from shadowy threats to open assault on every corner of my life. Daniel drove me back to Killingsworth Street to collect the last of my belongings from the apartment I had once shared with a college friend. I thought maybe Randall wouldn't know where to find me there, but I was wrong. The lock on the front door was splintered, the frame cracked from where it had been forced open. Inside, the small living room looked like a storm had passed through. My dresser drawers were dumped in piles, photographs shredded into confetti across the carpet. The one that cut deepest was a framed picture of my father, the only one I had left of him smiling in his Swan Island work uniform. The glass was smashed, the image torn down the middle. I pressed the pieces to my chest and felt a cry choke me. Daniel's hand gripped my shoulder, grounding me, but his face had gone hard with fury. "He's trying to erase him," Daniel muttered. "Erase Dad. Erase you. But he won't." A spray of black paint slashed across the wall in uneven letters. "Family first." The sight made my stomach twist. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a demand to fall back into silence. The police came again, documenting everything, promising that the protective order paperwork would be expedited. Still, the damage was done. My safe places were gone shredded like the photograph in my hands. That night back at Daniel's, I tried to study the credit reports again to focus on numbers instead of fear. But my phone buzzed. Another voicemail. I pressed play. My skin cold. Linda's voice, fragile but firm, filled the room. "Emily, please listen to me. If you testify, you'll destroy what little we have left. Randall made mistakes, yes, but he's your stepfather. Don't let outsiders judge us. Don't let them ruin our family." Her definition of family had become unrecognizable. Family wasn't someone who forged your name and left you in debt. Family wasn't someone who slammed your head into marble. And family wasn't someone who begged you to stay silent while your life collapsed. For years, her whispers had kept me chained. But now, they only fueled me. I pressed delete, and for the first time, it felt like severing a cord that had strangled me since childhood. Daniel noticed the look on my face. "She called again, didn't she?" I nodded. He leaned forward. Then we doubled down. "Every call, every message, every vandalized wall, it all goes into evidence. They want you silent, but your silence is over." His conviction steadied me. We sent the photos of the spray paint, the torn picture, the wrecked apartment to Miranda. Within hours, she replied with a plan. She would file for emergency protection subpoena the phone records and add the intimidation to Randall's charges. "He thinks he's scaring you back into compliance," her email read. "In reality, he's building my case brick by brick." That night, as the rain tapped against Daniel's apartment windows, I realized something profound. The very tools Randall used to control me, fear, silence threats, were now turning against him. Every act of intimidation was becoming evidence, every whisper another nail in his coffin. And as for Linda, her betrayal no longer broke me. It revealed her. She wasn't a victim. She was an accomplice. And when the courtroom lights blazed down on us, the world would see it too. The morning of the trial, the sky over Portland hung low, and heavy clouds pressed down on the city like a warning. Daniel drove us downtown in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw tight. The closer we got to the Multnomah County Courthouse on SW 4th Avenue, the tighter my chest became. I had walked past this building before on field trips and errands, never imagining I would one day be inside, not as a visitor, but as the victim, the witness, the girl who would have to face down her own mother and stepfather in front of strangers. We parked near Lonsdale Square, where the cherry trees stood bare, their branches thin against the gray sky. My legs shook as we crossed the street, the courthouse's stone facade towering above us, columns lined like silent judges. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust, muffled voices bouncing off marble hallways. Security wands beeped as people filed through metal detectors. I clutched the folder of evidence Daniel insisted I hold myself, photographs of bruises, medical reports from Legacy Emmanuel, credit histories from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. My life reduced to papers, but papers that spoke louder than whispers. The courtroom itself was colder than I expected. Dark wooden benches polished smooth by decades of bodies, fluorescent lights overhead, the seal of Oregon mounted high above the judge's bench. I sat at the prosecution's table beside Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park, a sharp-eyed man in a navy suit who radiated quiet authority. Daniel sat behind me in the gallery, his presence a weight of protection I clung to. Across the room, Randall sat in an ill-fitting gray suit, his wrists free for the moment, but his eyes wild, his jaw clenched as if he were still holding me down on that marble floor. Beside him sat Linda, my mother. Her hair was neatly combed, her dress pressed, but her eyes refused to meet mine. She sat so close to Randall she might as well have been tethered to him. The judge entered, a woman with silver hair swept into a bun, her black robe brushing against the polished floor. "All rise," the bailiff called, and my legs nearly buckled as I stood. When we sat again, Park rose to speak. He laid out the charges with deliberate clarity: assault, forgery, fraud, conspiracy. Each word landed heavy like stones dropped into water. Randall shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath, but Linda's hands stayed folded neatly in her lap. The first witness called was Mr. Dalton, the bank manager from Harbor and Hearth. He walked stiffly to the stand, his tie slightly crooked, his face pale under the lights. I gripped the edge of the table as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Park guided him through the events of that morning. Dalton's voice shook as he described Randall's rage, the slam that sent my head into marble the way the lobby froze. When Park asked what he found on the loan papers, Dalton's hands trembled as he held up the folder. The signature, he said, his voice breaking slightly, did not match her handwriting. And when I asked Emily if she had signed, she said no. I believed her. I locked the papers immediately and called security. The defense attorney tried to shake him, pressing about memory, about lighting, about whether he could be certain. Dalton straightened, his voice firmer now. I've worked in banking 20 years. I know when a signature is forged, and I know fear when I see it. Emily Warren was terrified that day. I will not forget it. My throat tightened as I listened. For once, someone outside the family had spoken the truth out loud. Not whispers, not denial. Truth. Randall cursed under his breath, loud enough for the judge to bang her gavel. Control your client, she warned. He sneered, but fell silent, his hands gripping the table so hard, his knuckles whitened. When the bailiff called my name, my stomach dropped. My legs felt like they were made of stone as I walked toward the witness stand. Every step echoed across the polished floor too loud, as if the entire courtroom was holding its breath. I raised my right hand, swore the oath, and lowered myself into the chair. The wood was cold against my palms. Park's voice softened when he began. Emily, can you describe what happened at Harbor and Hearth Community Bank on NE Broadway? My throat tightened, but I forced myself to look past Randall, past Linda's downcast eyes, and focus on the judge. He told me to co-sign a $200,000 loan, I said slowly. I told him no. He grabbed me, slammed my head on the marble floor, and told me I owed him. My mother told me to stay quiet. I was bleeding dizzy, but I said no again. The courtroom murmured. Park raised a photograph, one of the images Daniel had taken in his apartment, the bruise blossoming across my shoulder, the cut on my lip. Is this you, Emily? I nodded. Taken the night of the assault. He laid the photo on the evidence table where the jury could see it. He handed up the medical report next. This is from Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center. Diagnosis: mild concussion lacerations, soft tissue bruising. He turned back to me. Emily, did you ever sign the loan papers Mr. Pierce presented that day? Never, I said firmly. I refused. I've refused every time he's asked. Park walked slowly toward the jury, holding up a page from my credit report. And yet these accounts exist in your name. A Wells Fargo loan, a Bank of America account, both carrying thousands of dollars in debt. Did you authorize these accounts? No, I said, my voice sharp. I didn't even know they existed until last week. He nodded and turned to the jury. The documents were traced to the Alberta Street residence, the handwriting consistent with Linda Pierce. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery. I felt my chest tighten as Linda finally looked up at me. Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. The defense attorney stood trying to rattle me. Emily, you've lived under the same roof with Mr. Pierce for years. Isn't it possible you misunderstood, that you signed papers you didn't recall? My stomach flipped, but I held my ground. I may have been scared. I may have been silenced, but I have never signed away my future. I remember every refusal. I remember every punishment. And I remember that marble floor. My voice cracked on the last words, but the silence that followed gave me strength. Park approached again, his voice steady. Emily, why did you refuse? I looked directly at the jury, my hands gripping the edge of the stand. Because I wanted a life of my own. Because my father taught me to earn, not to steal. Because saying yes would have destroyed everything I worked for. And because silence isn't family, it's control. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, bringing the murmurs back down. Park rested his case, and I felt my chest heave as I stepped down from the stand. Daniel caught my eye from the gallery, nodding once pride and rage mingled in his face. Then came the parade of evidence. Miranda had built photographs of my vandalized apartment, the burned quilt in the sink, the spray-painted threat, family first. Each image projected on the courtroom screen, each word documented, turning Randall's intimidation into a public indictment. The jury leaned forward, faces hardening with every exhibit. And when the credit bureau reports appeared on the screen, scores falling from 720 to 480 balances, racking up month after month, the reality of the theft hung heavy. Park closed with the words I had been waiting for. This is not just assault. This is not just fraud. This is a family turned into accomplices. And this is Emily Warren refusing to be silenced any longer. The tension in the courtroom felt like a storm about to break. Randall shifted in his chair, sweat glistening on his forehead as the evidence piled higher. The jury's eyes no longer flickered with doubt. They were fixed on him like a spotlight. His attorney whispered frantically at his ear, but Randall shoved him away and lurched to his feet. "She's lying," he roared, pointing a trembling hand at me. "Ungrateful brat! I fed her, I clothed her, and this is how she repays me!" His voice cracked with rage, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The judge slammed her gavel. "Mr. Pierce, control yourself," but Randall only grew louder. "She wanted this. She knew about the loans. She's nothing without me." His words sprayed across the courtroom like venom, but instead of weakening me, they made the air clearer. Everyone could see what I had lived with, the fury, the entitlement, the violence disguised as family duty. The bailiff stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Randall's shoulder. He shook it off, but his wild eyes betrayed him. For the first time, it was not my head pinned to marble. It was Randall trapped under the gaze of strangers who saw through him. And then Linda stood. Her chair scraped against the floor as she rose beside him, her hands fluttering as though she might still shield him. But her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Randall, please stop." The courtroom froze. Every eye turned to her. She looked at me then, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw recognition, some flicker of the mother I had begged for. But her next words cut deep. "You're tearing us apart, Emily." My knees trembled, but Park rose quickly. "Mrs. Pierce, did you or did you not provide the Alberta Street address on fraudulent applications?" Her lips parted, no words coming. Park pressed again. "Yes or no?" She looked down, her silence damning. The jury scribbled notes. The judge's brow furrowed, and I felt the years of whispered, "Don't shame us," collapse under the weight of her refusal to answer. The verdict came faster than I expected. After closing arguments after the jury filed out time seemed to drag. My hands shook against the table, Daniel's steady presence the only anchor. When the jury returned, the foreman's voice was clear, deliberate. "On the charge of assault, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of forgery, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty." Each word struck like a bell tolling freedom. Randall sagged in his chair, his face drained of color. Linda covered her mouth, eyes wide, but still fixed on him, never on me. The judge's voice was firm. "Randall Pierce, you are hereby remanded to custody. Sentencing will follow, but effective immediately. You will be detained." The bailiff stepped forward, cuffs clicking around Randall's wrists. He jerked once, twice, but the metal held. The image burned into me, the same hands that had slammed me down, now bound by law. As he was led away, his eyes locked on mine, a final glare of hatred that no longer had power. The gavel struck once more, and the courtroom exhaled. I sat, frozen tears blurring the room, until Daniel's arm wrapped around me, pulling me against his chest. "It's over," he whispered. For the first time in years, I let myself believe him. The gallery emptied slowly, murmurs trailing into the hall, but I remained seated, staring at the seal of Oregon above the bench. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was louder than silence. It was mine. The courthouse steps smelled of rain and exhaust fumes as Daniel guided me outside. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted forward, and voices clamored for a statement. I had rehearsed something simple with Miranda Rios, but when I opened my mouth, only truth came out. "Family doesn't give you the right to destroy someone's future." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Silence protects predators." I won't be silent anymore. The reporters scribbled furiously, but I hardly cared. All I could think about was the weight lifted from my shoulders and the new one that had taken its place, the long road of rebuilding. Weeks blurred into paperwork depositions and preparation for sentencing. I met with probation officers, reviewed restitution claims, and sat in Miranda's office under the tall windows of Smith Tower while she outlined next steps. The prosecution will recommend 15 years given the conspiracy, the intimidation, and the fraud, she said, tapping her pen against a thick binder. The judge has discretion, but with the evidence I expect she'll be firm. The day of sentencing arrived in early spring. Multnomah County Courthouse was gray against a washed sky, cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom along SW 4th Avenue. I walked in wearing a simple navy dress borrowed from a friend at work, Daniel, at my side in his old service jacket. The courtroom smelled of polish and tension. Randall shuffled in wearing prison khakis, wrists cuffed, his swagger gone. He looked smaller than I remembered, though the rage in his eyes hadn't dimmed. The judge spoke first, reading out the charges again like an incantation: assault, identity theft, bank fraud, conspiracy, intimidation. She cited the evidence, medical reports from Legacy Emmanuel, banking logs from Wells Fargo, testimony from Mr. Dalton and Leah, the trail of forged applications, the anonymous threats, even the vandalism at my apartment. Each detail struck like a drumbeat, not for me, but for him, hammering down the reality he could no longer dodge. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood. My knees shook, but my voice held. "Your Honor, this isn't just about money or bruises," I said. "It's about losing trust in the people who should protect you. It's about waking up every day afraid to answer the phone or open the mail because my name was being used like currency. It's about being told by my own mother to stay quiet while my stepfather slammed my head on the marble floor of a bank." The room was silent except for the sound of the judge's pen scratching notes. Randall's attorney argued for leniency, painting him as a desperate man driven by financial stress. But the judge's eyes never softened. When she delivered her decision, her voice was like stone. "Randall Pierce, you exploited a position of trust, committed violence against your stepdaughter, and orchestrated a scheme that undermines the integrity of our financial system. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison to be served at the Sheridan facility." The gavel struck final and irrevocable. Randall's jaw tightened, his hands twitching in the cuffs. He muttered something under his breath, but the bailiff dragged him away before it could reach me. Watching him disappear through that side door was like watching a storm finally move past the horizon. But justice didn't end with him. Bradley Hutchkins, the loan officer who had enabled the fraud, faced his own sentencing. He received 6 years for bank fraud and conspiracy reduced for cooperation. He avoided eye contact with me in the courtroom, but his shoulders sagged with something that looked like regret. And then there was Linda. She hadn't been charged criminally, but the civil suit changed everything. Miranda uncovered the truth about the Cedar Lake cabin in Minnesota, the property my father had built and left in trust. Linda had claimed for years it was sold to cover expenses, but records showed it had been rented as a vacation property, the income hidden while she pleaded poverty. Her name was added to the restitution order. She sat pale and shaking in court as the judge explained that the assets would be seized. The cabin, the rental income, even her retirement fund from years with the school district, all of it subject to liquidation. When we left the courthouse, Linda followed me out her steps quick, her voice breaking. "Emily, please, you're ruining us. You're ruining me." I turned to face her, rain dripping off the eaves onto the sidewalk between us. "No, Mom," I said. "You ruined me when you stood there in that bank lobby and told me to stay quiet. You chose him. You can live with the consequences." She sobbed, reaching out, but Daniel stepped between us, his arm a barrier. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for walking away. The law had spoken, and so had I. Life after the verdict didn't swing into brightness overnight. It was more like a slow thaw after a long Portland winter, the kind where the sky stayed gray, even as buds began to push through. The first change came in the mail, a thick envelope from the court confirming restitution. The words looked sterile on paper, $80,000 payable in installments, but to me, it was recognition. Proof that what Randall stole from my credit and my peace would be repaired, not erased, but acknowledged in law. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table in his Beaverton apartment, the letter spread between us. "It won't make up for the bruises or the years," he said, his calloused hands drumming against the wood. "But it's a start." I nodded, tracing my finger over the embossed seal of the court. It was more than money. It was legitimacy. The Cedar Lake cabin became the second shift. At first, walking through the auction house had felt surreal. Strangers toured the property I thought had been lost, whispering about square footage and rental potential. But Daniel and I pooled what we could, combining part of the restitution with his savings, and when the papers came back with our names on them, I felt like I had exhaled for the first time in years. The cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was memory. It was Dad's hands in every beam. Reclaiming it felt like reclaiming him. Not everyone was supportive. At Fred Meyer in the Lloyd district, whispers trailed behind me in the break room. Some coworkers had seen news clips, others pieced together the gossip. "That's the girl whose stepdad went to prison," someone murmured one afternoon. But when I stepped into the room, those whispers stopped. My supervisor, Janet, pulled me aside later. "They're not judging you," she said softly. "Most of them are impressed. It takes guts to stand up like that." And she was right. Slowly, people began sharing their own stories in hushed voices. A colleague admitted her brother had drained her retirement fund. A neighbor in Beaverton confessed she'd co-signed a loan for her cousin and lost her house. It turned out betrayal within families was more common than I had realized, but cloaked in silence. My case had cracked that silence open, at least in my small corner of Portland. Community support surprised me most. One evening, Daniel and I walked into a diner on Alberta Street, just blocks from where Linda still lived, and an older man at the counter stood and shook my hand. "Good on you," he said. "Not everyone has the courage to take family to court. You saved yourself." His words stayed with me through long nights of doubt. Linda tried calling, of course. New numbers, new excuses. Once she even showed up outside Fred Meyer, her eyes hollow, insisting I had destroyed her retirement, her stability, her life. I looked at her, really looked, and realized I no longer carried the same ache for her approval. "You destroyed yourself," I told her calmly, then walked back inside without looking back. In the months that followed, I moved out of Daniel's apartment and into a small studio on Killingsworth Street. For the first time, every bill had only my name on it. I paid rent with money I earned, bought secondhand furniture, and decorated the walls with prints of Maud, Hood, and the Columbia River Gorge. It was modest, but it was mine. Therapy helped me process the deeper cuts. My counselor at Legacy Emmanuel explained that the grief I felt wasn't just about financial theft or physical assault. "You're mourning the mother you wanted but never had," she said. "And it's okay to grieve that while also building something new." Her words allowed me to stop blaming myself for hoping Linda would someday change. Hope wasn't weakness, it was proof I hadn't let their cruelty turn me bitter. By the end of the year, I was promoted at Fred Meyer, moving into a supervisor role. The recognition felt surreal. After months of courtrooms and police stations here was a different kind of justice earned through work, not survival. Janet told me, "You document everything you see patterns and you don't back down. Those qualities are rare. Don't lose them." Every weekend, Daniel and I drove north to Cedar Lake, patching walls, sanding floors, and repairing what neglect and vandalism had left behind. The air smelled of pine and freedom. Standing on the dock with a hammer in my hand, I realized revenge hadn't just been the guilty verdict. It was this rebuilding what they had tried to take stitch by stitch, nail by nail. The first time I unlocked the front door of the Cedar Lake cabin with a key that bore my name, I cried. The lock clicked and the smell of old cedar and lake air washed over me like a baptism. Daniel followed close behind, arms loaded with paint cans and tools, grinning like we were kids again. "Home," he said simply, and the word rooted itself deep in me. Healing didn't arrive in one sweeping moment. It came in fragments. In the mornings when I made coffee in my little studio on Killingsworth, the scent filling a space that was finally safe. In the afternoons when coworkers sought my advice instead of gossiping about my past. In the evenings at the cabin sanding the deck while Daniel patched roof shingles, the sound of hammers and laughter replacing years of shouting and slammed doors. The cabin became a symbol not just of survival, but of transformation. Every board we replaced felt like undoing a lie Linda had told. Every flower I planted along the garden fence felt like reclaiming the childhood she had sold for Randall's schemes. It wasn't revenge in the way I had once imagined loud, fiery final. It was revenge in its quietest and sharpest form, rebuilding a life they could no longer touch. I began classes at University of Washington that fall, commuting up from Portland on weekends until I transferred fully. Walking across the Seattle campus, surrounded by students buzzing with possibility, I felt both older and younger than my 19 years. Older for the battles I had already fought, younger for the future still unfolding before me. Professors who knew nothing of Randall or Linda saw me for what I brought to the classroom questions: curiosity, determination. For the first time, I wasn't the girl marked by bruises or credit fraud. I was just Emily Warren, a student with plans. But healing also meant facing the scars. I still jolted awake some nights to the phantom slam of marble against my skull. I still flinched when an unknown number appeared on my phone. Therapy helped, yes, but so did speaking out. When a local advocacy group for victims of financial abuse invited me to share my story at a workshop in Seattle, I almost refused. Standing in front of strangers dredging up pain sounded unbearable, but Daniel reminded me of that night on the courthouse steps. "You already spoke once," he said, "and people listened. Maybe now you can speak for someone who hasn't found their voice yet." So I did. The room was small. No cameras, just a circle of folding chairs and faces marked with the same exhaustion I had carried. I told them about the bank lobby on any Broadway, the marble floor. Linda's whisper, Mr. Dalton's pale face. I told them about police reports, fraud alerts, courtrooms, and restitution letters. And I told them about the quilt burned in my apartment. The cabin reclaimed the strength found in saying no. When I finished, the silence was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of judgment. It was recognition. And then slowly, people began to speak too. Afterward, a woman in her 60s hugged me tight and whispered, "I thought I was the only one." I realized then that revenge wasn't just about what Randall lost. It was about what I gave back to others, proof that survival was possible, that silence wasn't destiny. One evening, sitting by the Cedar Lake dock with Daniel, I asked, "Do you ever think Dad would be proud?" He didn't hesitate. "He'd be proud you didn't let them turn you small. He'd be proud you built something instead of breaking." The lake reflected the stars, steady and infinite, and for the first time, I believed him. The invitation came unexpectedly. A financial crimes conference in downtown Portland wanted a survivor's perspective. At first, I laughed, me standing in a ballroom at the Oregon Convention Center speaking alongside attorneys and bank executives. But the organizer had read about my case in the paper and insisted. "Your story matters," she said over the phone. "It will change how institutions respond." So I agreed. I stood at the podium in front of 200 people, the lights bright and unforgiving, my palms sweating against the wood. I began not with statistics, but with memory. I was 19 years old when my stepfather slammed my head on the marble floor of a bank in northeast Portland, I said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother whispered for me to stay silent. But a manager paused, and because he did the truth, unraveled. I walked them through the fraud, the forged signatures, the intimidation, and the trial. But I also told them about Cedar Lake, about planting wildflowers in soil my father once tilled, about building a new life in Seattle. When I finished, the applause was not polite, but thunderous, and afterward, people lined up to shake my hand. One woman, a teller from Salem, whispered, "You reminded me why my job matters." The conference turned into something more. Mr. Dalton, the branch manager who had once locked away those forged papers, reached out to me afterward. He had resigned from Harbor and Hearth, ashamed of the oversight but determined to change the system. Together, we developed training programs for community banks, teaching them to recognize insider fraud and protect customers. It felt full-circle justice not just for me, but for others who might never know their signatures were safe because someone remembered my story. Closure with Linda came quietly years later. A letter arrived forwarded to my Seattle address, her handwriting shaky, the envelope smudged. She wrote of loneliness, of regret, of the emptiness left when Randall's death in Sheridan prison was followed by the foreclosure of everything she had hidden. She asked if I could forgive her. I stared at the pages for a long time, hearing her voice again in the bank lobby whispering, "Don't shame us." And I realized forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation. I did not reply. Forgiveness lived in my decision not to let her consume any more of my life. Silence this time was mine to choose. By then, I was no longer the trembling cashier at Fred Meyer. I had finished my degree, moved into cybersecurity, and spoken at panels across the Pacific Northwest. I lived in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood in an apartment filled with books and sunlight, the dock at Cedar Lake still waiting every summer. Daniel and I rebuilt not only the cabin, but our bond as siblings, stronger than the fractures of our past. One evening, as the sun sank behind the Olympics, I sat at my desk drafting a speech for another advocacy event. I thought of that girl on the marble floor bleeding while her mother urged silence, and I whispered to her, "You did it. You survived. Family that demands silence isn't family. It's control." My revenge was never about watching Randall in cuffs or Linda lose her assets. My revenge was living free, telling the truth, and helping others find their voices. So now, I turn the question to you. Have you ever faced betrayal that cut deeper because it came from blood? What did you do when silence felt safer than speaking out? Share your story. I want to hear it. Because the moment we speak, we stop carrying shame that was never ours to begin with. The seasons turned slowly, and with each one, I felt the distance grow between who I had been and who I was becoming. By the time another spring bloomed in Portland, the city looked the same gray skies breaking into sudden sunlight, cherry blossoms scattering along the Willamette, but I no longer walked through it as the girl who flinched at shadows. I walked as someone who had reclaimed her name. Closure didn't arrive in a single moment. It was a series of realizations stitched together like the quilt my grandmother once made before it was ruined in Randall's rage. The first realization came on an ordinary Tuesday at the grocery store. I swiped my debit card and held my breath out of old habit, expecting the decline, the embarrassment, the sudden rush of panic. Instead, the screen flashed approved. It was small, almost laughable, but it felt like victory. My name was no longer radioactive. It was mine again. Another realization struck me at Cedar Lake that summer. Daniel and I had finished repairing the dock, and we sat with our feet in the water as the sun set gold across the lake. "We did it," he said, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell. I looked at the cabin, fresh paint on the siding, wildflowers in bloom, where we had planted them, the squeaky third step carefully restored, and I understood that revenge was not destruction, but creation. They had tried to erase my inheritance, but instead I had rebuilt it stronger than before. The final realization came during therapy when my counselor asked, "What do you want your future to look like, Emily, now that you are no longer surviving?" I stared at her, struck silent. For so long, my energy had been spent untangling fraud, filing police reports, testifying, patching wounds, both physical and financial. I hadn't thought beyond survival. "I want peace," I finally whispered, "and I want to help others find it too." Saying it aloud felt like setting down a burden I had carried for years, and so I began weaving my pain into purpose. I volunteered with a nonprofit that helped victims of domestic financial abuse, telling my story in small support groups and watching as others found courage to tell theirs. I partnered with Mr. Dalton on training programs, speaking not only to banks but to schools and community centers. My story became a tool not just for me, but for others to break free from silence. The moral of my journey crystallized in those moments: family that demands silence is not family. Real family protects. Real family listens. Real family never asks you to sacrifice your future for their mistakes. What Randall and Linda had demanded of me wasn't love. It was control dressed up as obligation. Recognizing that freed me from guilt, from shame, from the endless loop of what-ifs. The irony was not lost on me. Randall's greatest weapon had been the belief that I owed him loyalty. Linda's greatest plea had been not to shame her. And yet the very shame they feared became their undoing. Exposed in public court, their schemes collapsed. Their whispers of "stay silent" turned into the echo that convicted them. Justice didn't come quietly, it came in bright lights and open doors. As I looked toward the future, I knew my story wasn't just about betrayal and survival. It was about choice. The choice to say no even when it hurt. The choice to testify even when my voice trembled. The choice to build something better even when ruins surrounded me. That was the revenge. That was the healing. The day my mother died, I didn't cry. The call came from her sister in Minnesota, her voice hesitant as she said Linda had passed quietly in a nursing home 2 states away. There was a pause, as though she expected me to rush to the funeral to fold myself back into a family that had once devoured me. But I only said, "Thank you for letting me know," and hung up. Closure didn't come from her death. It had come years earlier when I chose silence not as surrender, but as a boundary. Forgiveness had been my refusal to let her consume another hour of my life. Instead of a funeral, I drove with Daniel back to Cedar Lake. We carried a picnic basket and my daughter, her laughter spilling into the evening air as she toddled across the dock. She was too young to understand the weight of the place, but she understood joy. We grilled fish. Daniel caught that morning, told stories about Dad, and let the lake carry our memories. When my daughter asked Mama, "Why does Uncle Daniel call this the Freedom Cabin?" I knelt and told her the truth in words simple enough for her small ears. Because this is where we remembered that we didn't have to let anyone control us. This is where we learned to live free. She smiled, tossed a pebble into the water, and the ripples spread farther than I could see. In that moment, I realized revenge had never been about watching Randall rot in Sheridan or seeing Linda lose her assets. Revenge had been this: my child growing up safe, my brother laughing freely, my name restored, my future unwritten, but mine to hold. The chains had broken, and what remained was peace. Still, I never forgot the lessons carved into me. I check my credit reports each month, a habit I will probably never shake. I pause before answering numbers I don't recognize. I keep folders of documents neatly labeled, ready to defend myself against threats I hope will never come again. Scars remain, but scars are proof of healing, not just wounds. When I stand at podiums now, whether in bank conferences or small community centers, I end my story with the same words. Silence protects predators, not families. If your love comes with conditions that demand your pain, it isn't love at all. Speak even if your voice shakes, because your future is worth more than their comfort. And when I look into the audience, I see heads nodding, tears shining, people scribbling notes because they know exactly what I mean. For years, I thought justice would feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like breath steady, deep, and free. Justice wasn't loud. It was walking into my apartment and seeing only my name on the lease. It was planting flowers at the cabin and watching them bloom where ashes once smoldered. It was raising my daughter to know that family means safety, not sacrifice. So now I turn to you, listening to this story. Have you ever faced betrayal from the very people who should have protected you? Have you ever been told to stay silent when every part of you wanted to speak? Share your story. I want to hear it, because together we can prove that survival is possible, that silence can be broken, and that healing can be built one choice at a time. I survived, I rebuilt, and I refused to stay quiet. That was my revenge. That is my legacy. And if you're still standing in the shadows of someone else's control, know this: you deserve freedom too.